Voting is so important to me because our entire lives, past, present, and future, our opportunities, successes, failures, our education, housing, jobs, healthcare, and the economy are all shaped by elected officials at all different levels of government. Voting is not just a right, it is a responsibility. Voting matters, your voice matters, so please go out and vote to make sure that your voice is heard.
Voting is important to me to honor both those who sacrificed in order to secure this right for me and those who are still struggling to gain the franchise.
Despite many reasons growing up for my mother and I to feel invisible and small, my mother, Sandy Presley, may she rest in power, reminded me on every election day, and she was a super voter, that we were powerful. I believed her then, and I still do today. So when we step into that voting booth, we bring the totality of our lived experiences, and the vote we cast absorbs and honors it all.
Let's make sure that we use our vote so that women are represented, our voices are heard, and our democracy remains strong.
I will take my vote and I will make sure that we proceed into a brighter future where the playing fields are leveled and everyone can feel safe, equal, and loved in this country that they call home.
Voting is an integral part of our democracy, and democracy is not a spectator sport.
Now, more than ever, we need to secure and expand the right to vote. And that means restoring the Voting Rights Act, getting racist voter ID laws off the books, and passing a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to vote.
We stand on the shoulders of the women who helped us get to this point, and we do more.
It is important. Our lives depend on it.
Welcome to Women's Equality Day. My name is Freddie Kay. I'm founder and president of Suffrage 100 Massachusetts.
And I am Katrina Huff-Larman, vice president of Suffrage 100 Massachusetts.
Thank you for joining us to commemorate this historic day.
It was important to us in our organization that we commemorate today with as much reverence for the women's suffrage movement as possible.
100 years ago today, the 19th Amendment was added to the United States Constitution, allowing 26 million American women to vote, except for African American and other women of color who were prevented from voting by Jim Crow and other discriminatory laws.
Due to systemic racism, Black suffragists were excluded from suffrage protests, such as the one that took place on February 24, 1919, at the Massachusetts State House. The current Black Lives Matter movement enables us to better see and understand historical racism and how it continues playing a role today.
All suffragists, women of color and white women alike, worked tirelessly so that women could vote. It took over 72 years of fighting to win the vote and combat discrimination before the amendment became part of the Constitution on August 26, 1920, designated by Congress in 1973 as Women's Equality Day.
The movement is directly tied to the various civil rights movements of past and present, so we, along with leaders and organizers throughout Massachusetts, are sharing how deeply rooted those fights for rights are, how prevalent they still are today, and how they will shape tomorrow.
So without further ado, please enjoy Suffrage 100 Massachusetts, the fight for women's suffrage, looking back, marching forward.
"100 years since women earned the right to vote. "55 years since women of color secured theirs. This is a fight we won over the past century. But how many centuries of fighting did our ancestors endure before? And how many more will our descendants have left?
The history of women obtaining the right to vote in this country was extensive and disappointing, but our ancestors' persistence eventually paid off, and Massachusetts women played a key role in that achievement. Women's aspirations were restricted to being a wife and a mother, and as soon as a woman got married, her rights were eliminated entirely.
It was in 1776, right here in Quincy, Massachusetts, when Abigail Adams wrote the letter to her husband, John Adams, who would later become president, saying, "Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. We will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation."
Without a husband, women were financially restricted and vocationally limited by the societal institutions of the time. When a woman married, she gave up all of her rights. Even her personal property would become her husband's, including any money she earned. And if a woman was a slave, like Elizabeth Freeman, she had no rights.
Someone we don't discuss enough is Elizabeth Freeman. She was born into slavery with the name Mum Bet, and she lived in Sheffield, Massachusetts during the 1700s. As it's been said, she overheard men reciting the Massachusetts Constitution, specifically that mankind is equal, free, and independent of each other. 9 years later, she sued the state to have the Constitution apply to her. Eventually, Mum Bet won her freedom and renamed herself Elizabeth Freeman. Amazingly, her court case eventually led to the outlawing of slavery in Massachusetts. And this is when things really took off.
Let's fast forward to the early 1800s, where the early abolitionist movement is really taking off. At this point, slavery is illegal in Massachusetts, but racism is alive and well. The year is 1831, and Sarah Parker Ramond is a teenager in Salem, Massachusetts. You'd think she and her family were the lucky ones, being born free in a country where slavery continued to thrive. But unfortunately for Sarah and her sisters, their black skin remained. And with it, so did the prejudice of white America.
The confinement of free African Americans was all too evident, and Sarah was motivated to pursue a life of activism, including anti-slavery and women's suffrage. Sarah eventually moved to Europe, where she is believed to be the only black woman to sign the first women's suffrage petition in Great Britain.
In 1838, Angelina Grimke made history at the Boston State House as the first woman in our country's history to address a legislative body. She delivered 20,000 anti-slavery petitions, all signed by women, and boldly stated, "We are the citizens of this republic, and as such, our honor, happiness, and well-being are bound up in its laws, politics, and government."
As more and more women joined the anti-slavery movement, discriminatory encounters with male abolitionists left many women wondering why their lives were still not held in the same regard as men.
This is the alley on 5th Avenue. I am a piece of clay, gray and dull but necessary. I am destined to fill every frame. I am cut, ripped apart, pressed on every side, but still I remain. My body is a grave. My voice is laid to rest while my thoughts and dreams gasp for air. My heart is battered. It is also buried there. I am black. Black like the little dress she wore on her first date. Black like the dress I will wear at my son's funeral. Black like the tux I have already purchased to bury him in. I am black like the most hated woman in America. It's been decades and our women are still marching. We marched down the alley on 5th Avenue. You ask me, what a woman is, and I will tell you Claremina's love, Katrina's voice, Michelle's intelligence, Freddie's commitment, Alexandria's passion, Susan's vision, Elizabeth's resilience, Harriet's journey, Sojourner's truth, Ayana's courage, Maya's words, and the list goes on and on down to the very end of the alley. You ask me what it means to be a woman, and I'll tell you this poem. But if you ask me again, I'll tell you her name.
The Anti-Slavery Convention of 1840 changed the course of history. White female abolitionists crossed the ocean to attend the convention, all to discover they weren't welcome.
The women were actually forced to sit in a secluded area where they were unable to participate by speaking or voting at the convention. Although the women had support from allies like journalist William Lloyd Garrison and abolitionist Charles Lennox Remond, they were still silenced. I mean, really, can you imagine? Here you are trying to show your support for the movement, and men leading that movement say, "Thank you for showing up. We need all hands on deck." Oh, except yours. We don't want yours. Go sit in the corner and be silent. The experience led Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton to recognize the need for a women's rights convention, which was held 8 years later in 1848 at Seneca Falls, New York. They were joined by ally Frederick Douglass, who played a pivotal role in helping convince the participants to support suffrage for women.
2 years after that, the first National Women's Rights Convention was held in Worcester, Massachusetts. Suffrage leaders Lucy Stone, Abby Kelly Foster, Paulina David Wright, and Sojourner Truth organized and attended the convention to draw attention to the movement and persuade others to join. 1,000 people from 11 states attended in 1850, and 3,000 attended in 1851. The National Convention was used to demand for women the right to vote, own property, be admitted to higher education, and work in professions such as medicine and ministry. But many weren't supportive, including the media.
Look at my arm. Look at it. I have plowed and planted and gathered in the barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as hard and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I've borne 13 children and seed most all of them sold off to slavery. And when I cried out in my mother's grief, nobody but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Little man back there, little man in black. Yeah, you. He say, women can't have as much rights as man because Christ wasn't a woman. Well, then where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? He come from God and a woman. Man ain't had nothing to do with him. Thank you.
At this point, we had two of the most significant civil rights movements, abolition and suffrage, taking place simultaneously. and both fighting for their rights as people and citizens. So of course, they would continue working together and becoming an unstoppable wave of justice for all. Only they didn't.
Turns out, suffragists were still capable of racism, and abolitionists were equally capable of sexism. Go figure.
When the 15th Amendment passed, its failure to include gender left many embittered suffragists, creating a deep divide in the movement. While many African American women enthusiastically supported extending the vote to black men, even if not to women, many white women viewed it as a slap in the face that all women were told they'd have to wait.
Most unfortunate were the racist statements voicing resentment toward black men for not including all women in their efforts to achieve the vote. Even some of the women many of us have always considered suffrage sweethearts, such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, were guilty of this to an extent. This led to the split of the Central Women's Suffrage Organization into two segregated organizations.
Segregation was in full force, with women's suffrage organizing clubs becoming less and less likely to integrate both blacks and whites. Black reformers such as Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Charlotte Fortin Grimke, and Ida B. Wells formed the National Association of Colored Women, while the General Federation of Women's Clubs maintained a membership of predominantly white women, which almost entirely failed to address the challenges faced by black women and exhibited outright racist behavior.
On March 3, 1913, in Washington, D.C., Alice Paul and Lucy Burns organized a suffrage parade with thousands of marchers and spectators. Unfortunately, black women were not welcome to march, but were eventually allowed to march in the back of the parade, including the only black organization that participated, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Famously, Ida B. Wells, while told to march in the back, defiantly joined and marched with her Illinois delegation. In addition to the racism, sexism reared its ugly head during the parade when police officers stood idly as men attacked the women who were marching.
Let's talk numbers. 175,000 people attended the Women's March in Boston in 2017. The October 1915 suffrage parade in Boston included 12,000 marchers and 500,000 spectators. However, despite the success, it was defeated at the ballot box a month later.
Probably because at least half the people there didn't have the right to vote.
That's not fair.
No, it wasn't.
The suffragists were the first people ever to picket the White House. For 2.5 years, 6 days a week, the silent sentinels, as they were called, silently and peacefully picketed in the heat, the cold, the snow, the sleet, the rain, and they were jailed for it.
We are forever grateful to the women suffragists who guaranteed this right for us, and we celebrate them today and every day.
We demonstrated, protested, got arrested, did everything they possibly could to right a wrong that they felt needed to be righted, which was to give women the equal right to vote on who would represent them and their families and their lives here in the United States.
Those 21 brave women who had a peaceful protest at the steps of our State House. They stood up, they made their voices heard, they grew their numbers, and they took action. But it was actions like that that allowed for the movement to continue, for the 19th Amendment, allowing us to have the right to vote, to become part of our Constitution.
Leaders of one of the major suffrage organizations, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, hoped that women would soon be enfranchised, changed its name, and the League of Women Voters was born in February 1920. Later that year, the Massachusetts League of Women Voters was established. So, this year also marks the centennial for the League of Women Voters.
The 36th state to ratify was Tennessee, and it came down to one vote. 24-year-old Harry Byrne, the youngest legislator, was committed to voting against suffrage, but he received a letter from his mother. Theb Insminger Byrne urged him to support suffrage, and lucky for us, he listened to his mother.
Can you feel it? Can you see it? Can you hear it even now? We rise. Can you dream it? Can you dare it? Can you dare it even now? We rise. We are rising with the wind. We are lifted to the sky. Higher than we've ever been. We rise. We rise. Every great dream begins with a dreamer.
When the 19th Amendment was finally passed, it was a mark of progress for the 26 million American women who were given the right to vote. But we know that so many were left behind, and in fact continue to be left behind. The old Jim Crow laws that were used to prevent African American men from voting were then used to prevent African American women from voting. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and the like.
Indigenous people were still prevented by law from being considered citizens and therefore couldn't vote. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act declared that Indigenous people were citizens, but they were still not eligible to vote in every state election until 1962, when Utah became the last state to remove formal barriers.
Chinese Americans and immigrants weren't granted citizenship or the right to vote until the Magnuson Act, also known as the Chinese Exclusion Repeal Act of 1943. And it wasn't until the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 that Asian Americans were granted citizenship and the right to vote. And still, until this day, people in U.S. territories like Puerto Rico and Guam are not allowed to vote in federal general elections.
Centuries of protests and organizing, of murder and abuse. And finally, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed into law. On August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act banned the use of literacy tests and ensuring federal oversight of voter registration in areas where less than 50% of the non-white population had not registered to vote.
Although the 24th Amendment of 1964 made poll taxes illegal in federal elections, it wasn't until 2 years later, in 1966, that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled poll taxes illegal in state elections as well. Latinx, Asian American, and Indigenous people had gained the right to vote. However, there were language barriers until 1975, when the Voting Rights Act was amended to include voting rights for non-English speaking American citizens. Today, African American, Latinx, Asian American, Indigenous people, and all non-English speaking Americans are still fighting racism in our nation that continues to affect their political involvement.
With all these fights and all these victories, there was yet another marginalized group that didn't even have the right to get married throughout all of it. LGBTQ plus individuals have always existed and been a part of social justice movements, but many weren't able to live out like New Bedford-born suffragist Marie Equi bravely did. In fact, many female suffrage leaders lived together in what were called Boston marriages, forming both platonic and romantic partnerships alike. The first state to legalize same-sex marriage was Massachusetts on November 18, 2003. And it wasn't until June 26, 2015, that the Supreme Court ruled same-sex marriage legal in all 50 states.
As we proceed past the centennial of women's suffrage, we have to remain persistent and resilient as our ancestors did before. In 1923, the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced in Congress, and every year thereafter until it was finally adopted by Congress in 1972, sending it to the states for ratification just like the 19th Amendment. And the ERA was written by suffragists Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman.
By 1982, only 35 states had ratified the ERA. In 2017, Nevada became the first state in 40 years to ratify. And on January 27, 2020, Virginia became the 38th and last state needed for ratification.
Unfortunately, the struggle for it to be adopted into the U.S. Constitution continues today.
So many of the struggles women faced in their various fights for rights have continued to this day. Sexism, the gender pay gap, domestic violence, sexual harassment and assault, these are all still prevalent parts of so many women's lives. But there is another worth noting, and that is underrepresentation.
Did you know that only 23% of the United States Congress is women? Do you think women make up only 23% of our population? And of those, only 38% are women of color.
Women are now more than half of the population. So now that we have the right to vote, it's all the more important that we use that right and ensure that our voices are heard and our lives are valued.
And let's not take for granted what we have, but use it to support women of today and women of our future.
The right to vote is powerfully important. It gives every American voter a chance to make their voices heard, to elect leaders that reflect their values, and to hold them accountable once they're in office.
Voting is one of the most sacred rights we are granted as citizens of this nation. Restoring and encouraging the right to vote for those of us who have historically been left out and left behind is the only way our government can provide fair representation.
Our fights haven't stopped, though our voices have been silenced. So we ripped the muzzles off and pushed through the violence. They cut down our ancestors, but they never stayed down. So taller will rise and louder will sound as we carry the torch to fight disparity. Remember respect, remember compassion, stand in unity.
This land is your land, this land is my land, from California.
Well, voting means to me using the power that was given to me by my ancestors to have a voice, to empower and to create change in communities where people are disenfranchised and don't have opportunities and resources. And my vote can make a change for that.
Voting means that with the systems we have in place and with one small pen stroke, we can make significant change in order to better our futures.
When we didn't have the right to vote, women's issues were pretty much ignored or they were voted on by men. So the solutions that were proposed didn't really benefit women. And marriage rights, the fact that we couldn't own land or have property, and now we can.
Voting to me means using my voice to fulfill my civic duties.
Ça veut dire pour me faire devoir civique, ouais.
And to ensure that government officials and those in power are applying the laws correctly.
Et pour garantir que la loi appliquée correctement.
It sounds cliche, but voting means exercising your right. It is something that, much like education, no one can take away from you. And also, you are supporting someone's dream, whoever the candidate is that's running, or if it is the incumbent, you are helping that person continue to forge on with it. And too much blood was shed for us not to vote.
100 years ago, we didn't have that choice. We didn't have that ability to say,
I don't agree with what you're doing, so I'm going to go for the other person. I don't agree with what is happening around me, so I want to change that.
When I think of voting, I think of the word change.
To me, voting means I can have a role in helping the people I care about in my community.
Yo voto porque tenemos mucho que lograr. En este país hay muchos que no tienen voces y eso tiene que cambiar. Yo voto por ellos que sienten que el sistema no funciona para ellos y finalmente yo voto por mi libertad.
Oh, and remember to vote.